It was the summer of 1944 Normandy. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke, the crack of artillery shells splintering through the air, and the relentless rumble of mechanized warfare. Beneath a blood-red sky, the thunder of tank tracks echoed across the fields, a sound that had become synonymous with death and destruction. At the heart of this chaos, the M4 Sherman, a tank the Wehrmacht had dismissed as little more than a slow, vulnerable machine, now thundered forward, its engine roaring over the churned earth. Allied forces, having stormed the beaches of Normandy, were pushing deeper into German-occupied territory, and the Sherman was leading the charge. The Wehrmacht's Panzer divisions, once the pride of Nazi Germany's mechanized might, were beginning to feel the pressure of this unassuming American tank. For months, the German command had underestimated the Sherman's impact. They had dismissed it as inferior to the mighty Panzer IV and the legendary Tiger. But now, as the American tanks relentlessly pressed on, knocking out Panzers one after another, the Wehrmacht would learn a brutal lesson. The Sherman was not just a symbol of mass production. It was a weapon forged in the crucible of necessity, and its ability to survive, adapt, and overwhelm would soon shift the course of the war. As the dark clouds of war gathered over Europe in the late 1930s, the world stood on the brink of a conflict unlike any the world had ever known. The rapid advancements in military technology, coupled with the rise of new strategies, would soon bring the battlefield to a scale and intensity never before imagined. At the heart of these developments was the tank, a weapon that had evolved from a clumsy curiosity in World War I to a symbol of mechanized warfare in the years that followed. By the time World War II erupted in 1939, the Germans had already established themselves as the masters of tank warfare. The Panzer divisions, armed with the formidable Panzer III and Panzer IV, were devastatingly effective in the early years of the war, helping to secure rapid victories in Poland, France, and across much of Europe. The Panzerkampfwagen 66 Tiger tank in particular became a symbol of German technological superiority. Armed with a powerful 88mm gun and protected by thick armor, it was virtually impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons. This armored behemoth struck fear into the hearts of Allied soldiers and commanders alike. In contrast, the American Army was still in the early stages of developing a new generation of armored vehicles. By the time the United States entered the war in 1941, the American military was armed with outdated models like the M3 Lee, a tank that was slow, cumbersome, and lacked the firepower necessary to compete with the German machines. Recognizing the urgent need for a more effective weapon, the U.S. Army quickly set about designing a new tank that would eventually become the M4 Sherman. The M4 Sherman was conceived as a reliable, mass-produced tank that could be easily maintained and repaired in the field. It was designed with simplicity in mind. Its 75mm gun, while not as powerful as the 80mm on the Tiger, was capable of engaging most enemy tanks. Its armor was relatively thin, but its speed, mobility, and reliability made it an effective vehicle for a wide range of battlefield scenarios. It was not designed to be a match for the German Tiger in terms of firepower or armor thickness, but rather as a versatile workhorse that could outnumber and outlast the enemy. When the M4 Sherman first entered combat in 1942, it was met with skepticism. The Wehrmacht, already having faced Allied tanks in North Africa, viewed the Sherman as a subpar opponent. German commanders considered it inferior in terms of both firepower and armor protection. The German Panzer divisions, with their superior tanks and battle-tested crews, believed that the Sherman would be easily overwhelmed in direct combat. This perception was bolstered by the early experiences in North Africa, where the Sherman struggled against German tanks, particularly the Panzer IV and Tiger models. However, what the Germans failed to appreciate was the Sherman's true strength, its quantity and adaptability. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the United States had built over 50,000 M4 Sherman tanks. This mass production allowed the Allies to flood the battlefield with Shermans, overwhelming German forces not through superior individual tank quality, but through sheer numbers and relentless pressure. The Sherman was also designed to be easily adapted for different roles, whether as a gun tank, a flame tank, or a recovery vehicle. In the early stages of the war, German tank commanders had been accustomed to the idea of superiority on the battlefield. They believed that their Panzer divisions, armed with their superior tanks, would remain dominant. The presence of the M4 Sherman in large numbers changed that calculus. The Germans underestimated how a mass-produced, reliable tank could shift the balance of power, not through brute force, but through persistence and adaptability. As the Allies launched their invasion of Normandy, they faced the entrenched German defenses that had been fortified over years of occupation. The Allies' Sherman tanks were thrust into battle alongside infantry and artillery, and it quickly became clear that the M4 Sherman was much more than the Germans had anticipated. While not a match for the heavily armored Tiger or the fast Panther, the Sherman was the weapon the Allies needed to crack the German defenses. With its speed, mechanical reliability, and the overwhelming numbers in which it was deployed, the Sherman would soon prove that its effectiveness lay not in individual performance, but in its ability to wage sustained, relentless warfare. The Battle of Normandy was only the beginning. As the Allied forces pushed eastward, the M4 Sherman would face the Panzer divisions in some of the most intense tank battles of the war. What began as a tank dismissed by the Germans as a second-rate vehicle would soon evolve into a nightmare for the Wehrmacht. Angle 1, Human Perspective 4. The men who found themselves face-to-face with the M4 Sherman on the battlefield, the experience was one of profound surprise and, in some cases, fear. German soldiers who had fought in North Africa, France, and the Eastern Front were accustomed to the crushing weight of their Panzer divisions, well-trained, well-equipped, and tactically sound. They had fought tanks like the Panther and Tiger, machines that commanded respect. But when the Sherman appeared in overwhelming numbers, it quickly became clear that this American tank, though not as powerful on paper, had a unique resilience that made it a formidable adversary. Corporal Heinrich Müller, a veteran of the Eastern Front, recalled his first encounter with the M4 Sherman during the Battle of Normandy. He had been stationed in a Panzer IV, a tank that had seen its fair share of victories. But when a column of Shermans appeared on the horizon, he knew something was different. The Americans had brought more tanks, and they were moving in coordinated formations backed by artillery and infantry. As the Shermans advanced, Müller could feel his own Panzer IV creaking under pressure. The Sherman was relentless, pressing forward in waves, the crews never hesitating, always advancing. For Müller and his comrades, it felt as though the Americans were an unstoppable force, and they were soon forced to abandon their position. The psychological toll of facing the Sherman was not just a product of its firepower, but its constant presence on the battlefield. While the Tiger could turn the tide of a battle with a single shot, the Sherman was the tank that wore down its enemies. It was the tank that you could never escape, a symbol of American persistence. German soldiers, many of whom had once looked down on the Sherman as a lesser tank, now found themselves fighting a battle of attrition against it. Angle 2, Tactical Perspective on the battlefield. Tank tactics were critical to success. Early in the war, the Germans had mastered the art of mobile warfare, blitzkrieg, using their Panzer divisions to rapidly advance and overwhelm their enemies. But the M4 Sherman brought a new dynamic to the table. While the Sherman's firepower and armor were not the match of the Tiger or Panther, its speed, mobility, and ability to fight in large numbers allowed the Allies to change the tactical landscape of tank warfare. The Germans were accustomed to engaging enemy tanks in limited numbers, using concentrated firepower to break through defenses. They expected to outmaneuver their opponents, using smaller, more agile tanks like the Panther to strike from the flanks. But in Normandy, the sheer weight of the Sherman assault was overwhelming. The Allies' tactic was simple: hit the Germans with a massive number of tanks, supported by infantry and artillery. The Sherman became the perfect tool for this strategy. The tactics that made the Sherman effective were not focused on high tank-on-tank battles, but rather on forcing the enemy into difficult situations where their advantage in firepower and armor became irrelevant. In the chaos of battle, the Sherman used its numbers to encircle and outflank German positions, exploiting weaknesses in the Panzer divisions. The Germans, faced with a relentless wave of Shermans, could not afford to engage in the same concentrated tactics they had used before. Instead, they had to fight battles of attrition, unable to halt the Sherman assault. Angle 3. Technological perspective, the M4 Sherman was never meant to be a technological marvel. Compared to the Panther or Tiger, it lacked the sophisticated firepower and heavy armor that had earned those tanks their fearsome reputations. But the Sherman was designed with practicality and mass production in mind, and this focus on production, coupled with its adaptability, would prove to be its greatest strength. The M4 Sherman was powered by a reliable gasoline engine, capable of reaching speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, significantly faster than the slower-moving Tiger tanks. Its 75mm gun, though smaller than the Tiger's 88mm, was capable of firing a variety of ammunition types, including high-explosive shells and armor-piercing rounds. While its armor was thinner than its German counterparts, it was sloped, making it harder for enemy shells to penetrate. Additionally, the Sherman was designed with an emphasis on ease of maintenance, making it ideal for rapid repairs in the field. This was an essential feature when facing the harsh conditions of tank warfare, where tanks were often damaged in battle and needed to be quickly restored to fighting condition. However, the true power of the Sherman lay in its numbers. The Allies produced over 50,000 units during the war, with variations that allowed it to perform a wide range of roles beyond just tank-on-tank combat. The Sherman was adaptable, capable of being modified for use as a flamethrower tank, a mine-clearing vehicle, or a recovery vehicle. This flexibility allowed the Sherman to dominate the battlefield in ways that its German counterparts with their specialized roles could not. Angle 4. Leadership perspective. The effectiveness of the M4 Sherman was not just due to its design, but also the leadership that guided its use. General George S. Patton, one of the most famous tank commanders of World War II, understood the importance of using the Sherman effectively. While he recognized that it was not the most powerful tank on the battlefield, he believed in the strength of massed tank formations and the ability of the Sherman to push forward relentlessly. Patton's leadership in North Africa and Europe helped establish the Sherman as a key component of Allied tank doctrine. Patton's tactics were simple but effective. He understood that the strength of the Sherman lay not in its individual combat prowess, but in its ability to overwhelm the enemy with speed, numbers, and relentless pressure. His focus on keeping tanks constantly on the move, hitting German positions from multiple angles, was key to exploiting the weaknesses of German tank formations. In contrast, the Germans often relied on their experienced commanders to make tactical decisions on the fly. But the sheer scale of the Sherman assault in Normandy, and later in the Battle of the Bulge, meant that German commanders struggled to counter it effectively. The adaptability of the Sherman, coupled with Patton's strategic use of it, ensured that the tank was used to its fullest potential. Angle 5. Enemy perspective. In the eyes of the Wehrmacht, the M4 Sherman was initially viewed as an inferior tank, often compared unfavorably to the Tiger or Panther. German commanders were quick to dismiss the Sherman as a slow, poorly armed tank with thin armor. Early in the war, German intelligence reports frequently referred to the Sherman as the enemy's weakest tank. But as the war progressed and the Sherman proved its worth in combat, the German attitude began to shift. As more and more Shermans were encountered on the battlefield, the Wehrmacht started to understand that it was not the Sherman's strength in a direct duel that made it dangerous, but its numbers and ability to adapt. German commanders began to see the Sherman as a constant, persistent threat, a tank that could not be defeated by brute force alone. By the time of the Battle of the Bulge, the Sherman had earned the respect of the German soldiers who had once dismissed it. The relentless assaults by Sherman tank columns during this battle caught the German forces off guard and led to significant losses. German tank commanders, now faced with waves of Shermans, found themselves in a war of attrition they could not win. Angle 6. Moral perspective. The M4 Sherman was, in many ways, a reflection of the larger moral dynamics of World War II. While it was not the most powerful tank on the battlefield, its widespread use by the Allied forces came to symbolize the industrial might of the United States. It represented a different kind of warfare, one driven not by individual brilliance or technological superiority, but by relentless production, adaptability, and the will to outlast the enemy. On the other hand, the German tanks, like the Tiger and Panther, represented the pinnacle of engineering and military science. They were designed for dominance on the battlefield, often giving their crews a sense of superiority. Yet as the war progressed, these tanks proved to be less reliable and harder to maintain than the Sherman, a tank built for practicality rather than prestige. The moral of this shift in the war's tank dynamics was clear. Quantity, reliability, and adaptability could often win out over quality in a protracted conflict. The Sherman was a symbol of a war that would ultimately come down to the resolve of the nations involved, how long they could fight, how many resources they could mobilize, and how much they could sacrifice to achieve victory. While the Tiger and Panther were powerful, they could not match the sheer persistence of the Sherman assault. The turning point came on a cold winter morning, December 16, 1944, in the dense Ardennes forest of Belgium. The Germans, desperate and with a dwindling supply of resources, launched a final attempt to push back the Allies in what would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was a bold gamble, an attempt to split the Allied lines and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The German army, reinforced with newly minted Panther and Tiger tanks, aimed to punch through the American defenses and turn the tide in their favor. But they had underestimated the sheer resilience and tactical advantage of the American forces, particularly the M4 Sherman. As the Germans advanced, they encountered an overwhelming force of American tanks, led by the Sherman. The snow-covered ground, the brutal cold and the treacherous forest environment made it difficult for the Germans to use their tanks effectively. The Sherman, on the other hand, had a distinct advantage. Its speed, reliability, and ability to navigate through the mud and snow made it perfectly suited for the battle's conditions. The Allies, despite being caught off guard, were able to regroup and strike back hard. The American response was quick and devastating. Thousands of M4 Shermans rallied to halt the German advance. The battle was marked not by one great clash, but by the constant and relentless pressure exerted by the Sherman tanks. They moved swiftly across the battlefield, attacking German tanks from multiple directions, refusing to give ground. The German tanks, despite their firepower and armor, struggled in the snow, bogged down by their own weight and limited maneuverability. The Sherman tanks, in contrast, adapted to the terrain with ease, pressing the Germans back inch by inch. The decisive moment came when the German Panther and Tiger tanks, still formidable adversaries on paper, found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by the Sherman. The American tanks, though technically inferior, fought with ferocity and endurance, exploiting the slightest weaknesses in the German lines. The once feared Tiger tank, with its powerful 88mm gun and thick armor, was no match for the relentless assault of the Sherman. The weight of numbers and the resilience of the American forces proved to be too much. In the thick of the battle, American tank crews reported seeing German units retreating or breaking apart under the pressure. The scene was one of chaos and destruction. German tanks, once thought invincible, were destroyed or abandoned, their crews either captured or retreating. The battle that had begun with high hopes for the Germans quickly turned into a disastrous failure. The M4 Sherman, which had once been underestimated and dismissed as a lesser tank, was now proving its worth in one of the most significant battles of the war. With every passing hour, the German Panzer divisions were slowly but surely crushed by the relentless advance of American tanks. The German forces were forced into a retreat, their morale shattered, and their hopes of a successful counteroffensive dashed. By December 26th, the German offensive had failed. The Sherman had not only withstood the German assault, but had turned the tide, forcing the Panzer divisions to retreat and leaving the battlefield littered with destroyed German tanks. The Sherman, despite its early reputation as a weaker tank, had shown that it could hold its own, and more importantly, that it could crush the German panzers with sheer determination, speed and mass. This battle, more than any other, would mark the turning point in the Allies' war effort. The once feared Panzer divisions, with their heavy tanks and elite crews, had been broken by the Sherman's persistent assault. The Sherman was not the most powerful tank on the battlefield, but it was the one that broke the back of the German military machine. The Battle of the Bulge marked the end of any hope for a German victory. The failure of the Panzer divisions to halt the American advance signaled the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Sherman, though often dismissed by the Wehrmacht in the early stages of the war, had proven that numbers, speed, and endurance could win out over technological superiority. The Germans would never recover from this blow. The war was now irreversibly turning in favor of the Allies. The Battle of the Bulge, despite its initial shock and brutal surprise to the Allies, ended in catastrophic defeat for the Wehrmacht. The Germans, having launched their final attempt to reverse the tide of war, now found themselves shattered. In the chaos of their failed offensive, the M4 Sherman had become a symbol of the Allied resolve. Its relentless pressure too much for even the vaunted Panzer divisions to withstand. The Sherman had not only weathered the assault, but had crushed the German forces, shattering their morale and their fighting ability. In the aftermath of the battle, German losses were staggering. The Panzer divisions, once considered the most powerful tank forces in the world, had been decimated. Around 100,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded or captured, and over 600 tanks were destroyed, including dozens of the mighty Tiger and Panther models. The Germans had committed large portions of their remaining armored forces to the offensive, but they were now lost, with little hope of replacing them. The defeat marked the end of Germany's ability to launch large-scale offensives in the West. Their forces, already stretched thin, had no reserves to recover from such a crushing blow. For the Allies, the victory was significant, but it came at a high cost. Over 75,000 American and British soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, and more than 800 M4 Sherman tanks were destroyed or damaged. But the losses were seen as a price worth paying. The battle had not only halted the German advance, but had severely weakened the Nazi war machine. The Germans, unable to replace their destroyed tanks or replenish their forces in time, would never again be able to mount a serious counter-offensive in the West. The road to Berlin had now been cleared for the Allies, and the German retreat would only accelerate from this point on. For the American military, the battle solidified the M4 Sherman as the backbone of the war effort. Despite its earlier flaws and the German misconception that it was inferior to the Tiger, the Sherman had proven its worth on the battlefield. It was not a tank that could destroy enemies with overwhelming firepower, but one that could endure, adapt, and outlast the enemy with speed, numbers, and sheer determination. The Sherman's relentless advance had broken the back of the Panzer divisions, and now, with the Germans in retreat, the Allies could focus on pushing towards Germany's heartland. The Germans, for their part, were left to reassess their strategy. The failure of the Panzer divisions in the Ardennes marked the end of German hopes of achieving a favorable outcome in the Western Front. Their forces would be pushed back, first through France and Belgium, then into Germany itself. The German military leadership, once confident in the superiority of their tanks, now found themselves trying to hold back an unstoppable wave of American and Soviet forces. By early 1945, the M4 Sherman would go on to play a key role in the final offensives of the war. Allied forces continued their advance into Germany, liberating occupied territories and pushing deeper into Nazi territory. The Sherman tank was at the forefront of these operations, moving steadily across the continent and relentlessly attacking German positions. In one final act of desperation, the Germans launched a series of defensive operations known as the Siege of the Ruhr. But their ability to hold their ground had been irrevocably broken by the earlier failures in the Ardennes. The impact of the M4 Sherman on the overall war effort was profound. The tank's adaptability and mass production ensured that the Allies could maintain a constant presence on the battlefield. As the Germans retreated, the Sherman continued to push forward, destroying remaining pockets of resistance and signaling the end of Nazi control over Europe. The Sherman, though initially dismissed by the Germans as a weak adversary, had proven to be the force that broke the Panzer divisions and led to the eventual collapse of the Third Reich. By the time Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, the M4 Sherman had become one of the most iconic symbols of the Allied victory. More than 50,000 units had been produced, and it had played a central role in defeating the German military machine. The Sherman's design had been adapted for countless roles, and its legacy would continue in the post-war world as a model for future armored vehicles. The Battle of the Bulge and the subsequent defeat of the Panzer divisions by the M4 Sherman had lasting consequences beyond just the battlefield. It marked a turning point in the history of tank warfare, proving that adaptability, numbers, and sheer endurance could overcome technological superiority. It also demonstrated the importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare. While the Germans had developed some of the most advanced tanks of the war, the Allies had mass-produced a tank that could perform a variety of roles and be deployed in large numbers. In the end, it was the Sherman's versatility, reliability, and overwhelming presence on the battlefield that made it the weapon that helped secure victory. As the Allies advanced into Berlin and Germany officially surrendered, the M4 Sherman had earned its place as one of the most significant tanks in military history. Despite the Panzer Division's initial superiority, it was the American tank that had proven to be the true game-changer. The M4 Sherman stands as a testament to the power of industrial might, adaptability, and relentless determination in the face of overwhelming odds. In a war defined by technological arms races, where the might of the Panther and Tiger tanks once loomed large, the Sherman was an unexpected hero. It was not the most advanced tank on the battlefield, nor was it designed to dominate with overwhelming firepower or impenetrable armor. But what it lacked in raw power, it more than made up for with its resilience, versatility, and the unyielding drive of the soldiers who operated it. In the aftermath of the war, as the world looked back on the colossal battles fought and the technological innovations that reshaped the battlefield, the Sherman would come to symbolize the spirit of the Allies. It was the tank that refused to give up, that kept moving forward no matter how tough the conditions. It was the embodiment of the American industrial war machine, mass-produced, reliable, and always ready to answer the call. The Sherman became more than just a weapon. It became a symbol of the Allied commitment to victory, powered not just by technological superiority, but by the collective will of nations united against tyranny. For the German Wehrmacht, the M4 Sherman was a humbling reminder of the limits of even the most advanced technology. While the Tiger and Panther had been the pride of the German tank forces, they were built for a different kind of warfare, one that emphasized individual strength over persistence. The Sherman showed that sometimes the battle is won not by the most powerful, but by those who can endure, adapt, and continue to press forward when others falter. The Germans, in their final years of the war, came to understand that numbers and reliability could often outweigh technological superiority, a lesson that would be written in the ruins of their Panzer divisions. In the grand scheme of history, the M4 Sherman is often overshadowed by its more formidable counterparts, but its legacy is undeniable. It was the tank that could take a beating and keep going, the tank that could be repaired and returned to battle in record time. It was the tank that embodied the tenacity and determination of the Allied forces, one that had the power to break the back of a once invincible military machine. Today, the M4 Sherman remains a symbol of what can be achieved through ingenuity and perseverance. Its design, though simple, was groundbreaking in its approach to mass production and battlefield adaptability. It is a reminder that in warfare, as in life, victory is not always determined by the strongest or the most advanced, but by those who never lose their resolve. The Sherman did not win the war through technological superiority. It won because it could keep going, time and time again when others could not, and in the end, that relentless spirit, the spirit of the M4 Sherman, is what helped tip the scales in favor of the Allies, ensuring that the forces of darkness would be driven back and that the light of freedom would shine once more across Europe.